Ukraine and Qatar, two nations with seemingly little overlap. But what brought these countries closer? How did Qatar become involved in Ukraine's most sensitive humanitarian issues? And what cooperation opportunities between Ukraine and Qatar should we look out for? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. This episode is part of a joint series, Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. In this episode, UkraineWorld's Deputy Chief Editor, Anastasiia Hersymchuk, spoke with Dr. Omar Ashour, Professor of Security and Military Studies at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies in Qatar, and Hanna Shelest, Director of Security Programs at Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, and Editor-in-Chief of Ukrainian Analytica. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm Chief Editor of UkraineWorld and President of PEN Ukraine. You can support us at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resistinggmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This podcast was created with support of the International Renaissance Foundation. So let's start.
Hanna, Omar, thank you for joining. Ukraine and Qatar. These two nations are separate by geography, their culture and history are different. Yet, in the complex web of international relations, these countries have found points of convergence. So, let's start our conversation with a particularly practical and deeply human aspect of bilateral relations. Unfortunately, it emerged from the most unfavorable circumstances, which is Russian aggression against Ukraine. So, Qatar has helped Ukraine to return its children from Russian deportation. Omar, how did this come about? And more importantly, how did Qatar manage to become an effective intermediary in this sensitive situation?
So it's there's a larger story and there's like the more direct story. The larger story has to do with the approach that the Qatar has taken since the change of leadership in 1995 and the redirection of the Qatari diplomacy to be more involved regionally and internationally. So that change of leadership developed into what we can call peace diplomacy, which is basically attempting to intervene in conflicts in a positive way to promote some sort of a peaceful outcome, not necessarily for the entire conflict, but at least for parts of it, and in some cases to the entire conflict. So Qatar has been doing this for a while as part of its vision to the region, which is it's also a complex region. It has to do with supporting of transitions towards democratic means during the Arab Spring, for example, but also it goes beyond that. But the issue of peace diplomacy has been consistent for over 2 decades now. It was practiced in Lebanon, it was practiced in Yemen, it was practiced in Sudan, it was practiced in Afghanistan between the US and the Taliban. And then most recently, this was part of the policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. But also there is a history between Qatar and Russia. The Russian Federation have committed an assassination attempt that was successful that killed Zalim Khanyandarbayev, the former provisional president of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria in Doha and southern port. And since then, the relationship was a bit tense with the Russian Federation, and but also on one end there's also caution in dealing with it, and in that sense, it was the overview was we need to deal carefully, very carefully with Russia specifically. Um, so that this is the macro picture, if you wish, and a bit of the history behind it. But the micro part is that they wanted to get involved. The issue of children is sacred in the Qatari culture. Any Qatari official, if you told him that there are 20,000 children were kidnapped from a country that has been invaded, by a stronger neighbor. And by the way, you were about to be invaded in 2017, and luckily the invasion did not happen. He or she will identify with that. Identify with that on two levels: on the level of the children and the human security part, on the level of the peace diplomacy part, and on the level of being the smaller side, that is getting attacked by the bigger bully. So put all this together, and it came naturally in a way. And the other dimension of it is clearly it's good for the image of the country. They had already some significant, shall we say, economic investments and other bits in Russia that Russia would like to keep in this period. They did not join the sanctions. They talked to the Russians. So in a way, they have some leeway within Russia, and they have enough resources on that end, and they wanted to help Ukraine. Yeah, so in a way, to summarize it, the heart was with Ukraine. You saw the Doha forum, not the last year, but the one before it. It was all about Ukraine, but clearly the mind fear Russia because of the examples that I've given from the history. And they had the resources, as I said, but I think that so far they did two attempts, two major trips. They helped mediate in about 16 children were returned back to the families, to their Ukrainian families. They funded part of these, or partly funded some of these operations, and the rest were mostly civil society organizations involved. But still, it's a very long way to go. We're talking about almost 20,000 children. I think 388 of them were returned, so we're about 400. So only 2% returned. 98% are still in Russia. The Ukrainians realize that, the Qataris realize that, and it's an ongoing operation. It's still we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg so far.
Hopefully, the process will continue and will go smoothly, even though it's a complicated one. And moving from this micro aspect, let's zoom out a little bit and examine Qatar's stance on Russian aggression against Ukraine in general. So let's look at this political dimension. And this is particularly interesting given the Middle East history and especially the Gulf region. Like we know that there were examples there when larger states attacked smaller ones. So, how does Qatar view the Russian aggression against Ukraine in general? And has the Qatari stance towards this war changed since 2014, when the Russian aggression actually started, till 2022, when the full-scale aggression started? And let's look at this aspect from two sides. Like, let's look at the Ukrainian perception of Qatari position, and let's analyze the Qatari position itself. And Hanna, let me address this question to you first.
That's very interesting to compare 2014 and 2022, because in 2014, many countries thought that that is just a local war between, or even not a war, but some kind of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and nobody except of the transatlantic community really wanted to intervene in this situation. One of the reasons is that there have not been the global consequences of that aggression in spring 2014. The situation is absolutely different in 2022 because many countries, including Qatar, looked at this situation from two sides. First is the direct implications, what it can have. So for some countries, that's been the food security, for example, or the weapons supply, or the Russian role, or anything like this. And we know that because of Syria, because of Russian intervention in other Middle Eastern and African issues, that's been the issue that other Arab countries really followed. But also, that was the clear projection of those threats and challenges that been showed up because of the Russian aggression, like the violation of the international laws of any types, the United Nations Security Council permanent member that is an aggressor. And all the statements that Ukraine is not a state, that was definitely reflecting and referring to the Qatari experience some years ago when the Saudi leadership been speaking that Qatar is not a real state. So all of these, the direct and more global consequences and implications of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, that's resonated in the minds of a lot of people. And here with Qatar, even that before this, we had some economic relations. It was good relations, more active than maybe with some other states, less active than with the big states. About the countries of the, let's say, just general interest. And suddenly, all that experience of Ukraine in 2022 really resonated with Qatar when they realized that, okay, if even Ukraine, with all those security promises, the big country in Europe, had these problems and the international community could not react immediately properly, what does it mean for us? We felt the same. We felt in the past, we knew how we work with this. We knew that it can continue if not punished or mediated, because the aggressor and other aggressors will always understand that they can repeat the same. And don't forget that for Qatar, for the last 2 years, that's been even multiplying or amplifying all these issues, because the energy security came in mind and understanding because of their relations with Iran. The Iran role itself, that's been definitely the issue to follow over there. The nuclear proliferation, that's been the issue that Qatar cared about because of their neighbors and those countries with whom they have difficulties. And many other of the issues that just reflected their raw and past experience and understanding that other countries can just become more threatful to them in case, and also the US security guarantees and military bases. That's the factor that we also should not forget, because a lot of those countries who had so-called US security guarantees, they've been looking to the international community and the US reaction about Ukraine and Russian aggression and started questioning, okay, if US is helping just half force to Ukraine, will they help us in case we have a major crisis in our region? So in this case, Qatar became in the same basket as South Korea, as Japan, as Israel, as some other countries of the Middle East, who started to analyze what is the US actions, how it acts in Ukraine, and what can we do. So because of this, it came not only with the lessons learned to the countries, but also what became very important. They started searching the ways of interaction, involvement, and when they feel it is moral for them to, for support of Ukraine. That's how not only the negotiations and mediation about the kids, but other types of support from Qatar also are coming to Ukraine, because they felt that the middle states should keep together, and if they can help with this injustice, that can lead to the positive results later.
And continuing this topic about the Qatar's stance on the Russian aggression, Omar, would you dig deeper and show us the key principles of Qatari foreign policy that actually explain the position of this country towards this aggression?
Sure, yeah, it's that needs a whole conference, by the way, but I'll try to shorten it. Just I agree basically with everything that Hannah said in that direction, but just to add a bit more bits. First, 2014 specifically. I remember when Yulia Tymoshenko came in Maidan and did this act of the wheelchair and everything. I got a bit emotional, and I was tweeting of the picture and commenting on it. And Al Jazeera kept on retweeting. Al Jazeera correspondents kept on retweeting, and I think it was yeah, it was many identified with this. Why? Because they saw the Arab Spring back then, Tahrir, Tripoli Square, what was happening in Syria. Many which was broadcasted by Al Jazeera 24/7, many identified with this. That this is okay. The Arab Spring is almost getting defeated, but here's another spring that is rising, which was actually, and the Arab Spring, when it came mimicking 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and also other revolutions in Serbia 2000 specifically, and others. So it was many identified with this, and then they looked at the invasion. They didn't understand what was going on. So it was just the moment, this captured picture of the Maidan with tens of thousands of people taking out the dictatorship, and until there, this was understood. After that, they didn't get really what was going on. But to be fair, the picture was lost on everybody. I was still serving in the British Army back then, and I remember the debates. But Boris Johnson was not supportive of Ukraine at all. Complete change from 2022. The discussions back then in the FCO, back then it was not the FCDO, it was just the FCO, and the MOD were not very supportive. I remember them well, and it was hurting because I had friends back then in Ukraine. So it was a different story all over. 2022 things changed completely. 2022 was, like Hanna said, it was seen as an aggression. It was seen as an invasion of the smaller side, getting bullied by the bigger side. And you saw the change in the Qatari diplomacy, almost 24-hour coverage by Al Jazeera and by other channels, and a very sympathetic coverage in a way. They still had to get the Russian guests, because the slogan of Al Jazeera is the opinion and the other opinion. That's the classic slogan. So they had to get the Russian guests. But at the same time, or the Russian opinion in this case, but at the same time, the coverage was very sympathetic. They had correspondents all over the country and so on. And I said that the Doha Forum, which is the official, shall we say, forum that Qatar provides every year, was almost 100% about Ukraine. The 2022, if I remember, yeah, 2022. And so that was the generic approach, but also, as I said, very careful about Russia, and attempting to help in terms of anything that has to do with peace diplomacy, whether it's human security affairs like children's security, or energy security, or issues that has to do with humanitarian support, even media support. That's okay. But until the weapon systems and the military support, then this is where they draw the line, because again, the history with Russia. So that's on one end. But on the other end, there was also this vision that the main difference is that Qatar, just for people to know, has one of the largest air bases, Al Udeid Air Base in Doha. That's one of the largest U.S. air bases, the largest ever in the Middle East, and one of the largest in the world. So it is comparable to Ramstein, to Osan, to Kadena in Japan. So among the very large U.S. base, actually, it is one of the four largest, basically. These are the four largest U.S. bases, with Patriot systems, with F-15s, with F-16s. So it is armed to the teeth, if you wish. Radar systems that overlooks the region. So in a way, they feel more comfortable, but in a way, they almost got invaded. So they see, the risks, as Hanna mentioned. They identify with Ukraine on that dimension, but also they see that at least we have the US here. We paid 1 billion for this base to be established back in '96, I think, and they're still here. So in a way, we're the Saudis or the Iranians decided to invade. At least we have some a strong, solid backbone there. Ukraine doesn't have that yet. So this is the main difference here.
From here, actually, a very interesting question or thing to think about emanates. You've both mentioned the humanitarian initiatives that Qatar launched to help Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. And you've also mentioned the situation that this situation have helped the regional states and Qatar in particular better understand that the security issues, the security problems are actually something that needs a very, very precise attention. And the Russian threat was also, let's say, reconsidered. But at the same time, Qatar has a very specific kind of relations with Russia. So, could you dwell on a little bit more on the nature of these relations with Russia?
So there are three, shall we say, major issues there. The in terms of the history. So there was Chechnya, right? There was Chechnya and there was Georgia, but Georgia was very quickly. The two Chechen wars were long ones, relatively speaking. The first 2 years, and the second depends on where do you put the line. 6 years all the way to Southern Alliance, so about almost 10 years. Um, so those were covered by Al Jazeera, and Russia did not appreciate the coverage. And also there was some hosting of some of the Chechen figures, including the former president who was assassinated, blown up in Doha. So things got tense on that dimension, on that security dimension. But then at the same time, there was an attempt to reconcile and move on. That ended with economic. So this was, security political issue, and then there was the economic issue. The economic issue is to cooperate and invest in the energy sector, in the Russian energy sector, which is happening until today. There's significant Qatari investments in the Russian energy sector, but also with the always putting the ones who will have our back in case of something happen. It is the U.S., and therefore always look to the U.S. and see, how far can we go. So always also coordinate with the U.S. And then there was the third issue when Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has happened. Then here there was talks to all sides in a way, and multiple attempts to try to negotiate some sort of micro human security achievements, including the children issue. But it never escalated to the level of a full proposal of for mediation on a macro level. The final issue with the Russians is that somehow Qatar took a middle way. So it's not like the UAE, just the neighbor over there that had a very tense relationship with since a long time, because two very different visions in the region. One is a vision of change and moving towards more reforms, shall we say, and the vision in case of the UAE, a vision of continuity, keep it authoritarian, keep it repressive, and continue as we are. So Qatar did not take that approach. So the UAE did not join the sanctions. Qatar did not join the sanctions. But the UAE, you saw the welcoming of Mr. Putin and complete endorsement of the Russian Federation in a way. Qatar kept a distance and attempted to switch that relationship. How is it? It's a very difficult line to hold, and it can change at any time. But I think the basis of it is that we had our fight, and we're done, and we have some investments there, and we would like to be in the middle and have some quick wins, quick humanitarian wins, that everybody will look good. Ukraine will benefit. Russia will look as if it's returning some of the children at least. And Qatar seems to be the mediator in that issue. So it's a very fine line to walk in, and it's not very stable. I have to say that. It can change at any point.
I would probably add a little bit about the economic cooperation that can be very illustrative in our case. Even before the war, the economic cooperation between Ukraine and Qatar was not that significant as with the many European countries, for example. But the Qatari companies been already looking to the investments in shipping and in the port administration and in ports in Ukraine. The Qatari Q terminals was going to take the Ukrainian port Olvia in concession, and that was like in the process and could be one of the biggest investments. Still, it's only one port, not the biggest Ukrainian port, so that is, from Qatari point of view, are not that significant investment yet. And that was 2020. At the same time, Qatar Investment Authority invested in Russian oil giant company Rosneft. So we can imagine that we're speaking about really significant and huge investment. And also the sovereign wealth fund of Qatar also invested in different spheres of Russian economy. And for both of these companies, just to get out of Russia would be very unbeneficial. That would be significant losses because they would not be able, due to the sanctions, to sell their assets or just to get out with the investment without a significant loss. So that is probably the clear case when a lot of countries tried to divide their policy from their money. So business continued almost as usual, even that we have not seen the new Qatari investments in the Russian Federation. They also understood that they don't want to be under the sanctions, even if they don't introduce the sanctions against Russia. But at the same time, understanding that in the political sphere, they should distance themselves as much as possible. But still, even with this distancing, this act of balancing always been the most important, because we can find plenty of cases of communications between the representatives of Russia and Qatar during the last 2 years. That's always been presented at as the mediation or the balancing efforts. But from their perspective, usually how we if to follow the statements or the scope of actions, it's still much lower interaction than what other Gulf countries had with the Russian Federation. So in this case, even if to compare, Qatar still took the most anti-Russian position probably compared to the other, not only Gulf, but I would say even in general Middle Eastern states.
You've mentioned a very important point about the security context and economic context that are separate on the one point, but on the other hand, we can state that these spheres are closely interconnected. And it brought me to a thought about the food security issue and how the current security situation actually undermines the global food security problem. And Ukraine has this grain initiative, and despite the war and the threats it's facing, it is still committed to guaranteeing the world food security. So, what is Qatari stance on the food security initiatives of Ukraine, and what is the role of Qatar here? I mean, in terms of supporting Ukraine.
Probably here is very interesting because Qatar itself is not dependent on Ukrainian grain. If you compare with Egypt, Lebanon, or some other countries whose supply really before the war depended significantly on Ukrainian harvest, for Qatar that was not an issue. So they would not feel the direct implications of the Russian blockade of the Ukrainian ports. But at the same time, Qatar was always very responsible for the other countries, first of all in the Middle East, but also in Africa. And for them, when they started to see what been the implications and the negative consequences for these countries, how it's changed the social dynamics, social economic dynamics, how it could lead to the, not maybe the hunger yet, but to the quite a significant crisis in food security for many countries, they definitely started worrying about. because that means they need to invest more in helping these countries to be able, because the price is raised and somebody needed to compensate. So here it came, for my opinion, more with the idea of the social responsibility and with the soft power that Qatar tried with the different charity projects implemented around the world, and especially in their region, rather than probably the threat directly for Qatar itself.
We have been talking about the security context, which is closely interconnected with the economic context of cooperation, and the geopolitical situation plays a huge and important part here. But this context is only one piece of bilateral relations mosaic. So now let's focus on more practical aspects of Ukraine-Qatar cooperation, and let's take a look at the spheres of mutual interests. So, what makes Qatar and Ukraine interesting to each other, and what are the prospects for further cooperation between the states?
The multiple issues that we've mentioned, I think one of them first, it's the so there are the moral dimension, there's the material dimension. The moral dimension, as I mentioned, there's a very strong interest on the Qatari side for peace diplomacy and trying to maintain at least some sort of international security dynamics, whether in the region or outside it or nearby it. Um, so this Ukraine is at war of liberation, and Qatar would probably, like Ukraine, would want to see an end to that war, because it represents a very serious international security risk, with direct implication to the regional security, and with other risks as well. So that's one dimension. On the moral side, if you wish. On the material side, of course, there's we talked about energy security briefly. Qatar would like to also, both Qatar and Ukraine would like to maintain the supply of energy, whether as a supplier or as a receiver, and also maintain energy security so it doesn't get threatened. Qatar relies on energy as its main source of income. Ukraine is both an exporter and importer of energy in many ways. So this area of energy security is probably of um, common high interest, I would say, high priority to both sides. And then the issue of food security, which Hanna mentioned as well. It's quite high on the agenda. But finally, the issue of defense. Both Qatar and Ukraine have neighbors that either invaded them or tried to, and both of them are the relatively smaller side. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe after the Russian Federation. Um, but it's still, compared to the Russian Federation, it is the smallest side. Qatar is a tiny country that is very rich, among the highest per capita income in the world, and therefore it looks like an easy, lucrative target for many. So both of them need defense. Ukraine has now a lot more experience in defense affairs on all types of combat branches, I think, from air to ground-based air defense to infantry to naval. And I think this experience of Ukraine can also be of a lot of interest to Qatar in many ways. So I think these are like the four main ones. There's one issue that I forgot that changed that also, as we talked before, on the corporations, the issue of the current conflict. I don't know if you want to address it, Israel-Palestine, mainly because it affected the attitudes within Qatar in a way, but somehow it rebounded. But if you want to address it later, I'm happy to comment as well.
I would probably add a little bit more to the possible cooperation, agreeing with all those fears that Omar just mentioned. But also, we need to understand that there are two levels of cooperation that is possible. The spheres that are all of them are important, but let's say that can be a priority right now, even during the war. And that is including the military security cooperation, that is including food and other spheres. But that is also spheres that are longer term in terms of their perspectives for the cooperation. And if we go to the short term, one issue that also should be mentioned is the nuclear security and the cooperation with the International Atomic Energy organization, because that's been always very important in the last years for Qatar, and they even sponsored some of their activities connected with the nuclear security, and they pay significant attention to the role of this organization in the nuclear non-proliferation. And that's the issues because of the Russian aggression that Ukraine became even more eager to work with. Even since 1990, Ukraine was very responsible and active in cooperation with the United Nations agencies about the nuclear non-proliferation and in terms of the civilian atom, peaceful atom. But after the Russian capturing of the biggest European nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, or attacks with the different missiles just near the nuclear power plants, or the threats of using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, this issue became even more important for Kiev. So that is the issue where Qatar and Ukraine naturally already had the core, not coexistence, but let's say the joint efforts that they can use further. But if we look to more of the future, we definitely can speak about the logistics. Qatar already invested around the globe a lot in the port infrastructure, and considering that Ukrainian port infrastructure have been significantly damaged by the Russian attacks, it means it will need investments, it will need proper management, and that's where Qatar can come. They already had this interest just before the war. And let's not to forget about IT. That's the sphere that is actively developed in Ukraine, even during the war. And that's where more and more Middle Eastern countries are really interested with the digitalizing the processes inside of the countries, but also investing in the IT and digital projects with the oil money, understanding the necessity for diversification of their future income. So that is the sphere where that can be like Ukrainian technologies with Qatari money can make a significant breakthrough. And then theoretically, that's probably not that significant if you compare with the military or with the ports, but soft issues. Qatar definitely been interested the last 10, 15 years in investing in different cultural and sports events in the universities. Let's not forget all those Western universities that have been brought to Doha, to the educational city. So that's demonstrating the interest in this sphere. And that's again where Qatar and Ukraine can cooperate, from bringing additional money to this sphere, helping to recover Ukrainian spheres, but also doing some joint events, especially when we're speaking about sport or culture. And the last but not the least, the sphere that is probably currently the least explored, and that being always a surprise for me, because when Ukrainian Prism traveled in April to Qatar within the global partnership projects, and we tried to ask this question at all the meetings that we had, we realized that it is extreme lack of information and knowledge that shocked us. That is the question of Crimean Tatars. Ukrainian indigenous Muslim population. And when you speak in the Gulf states, they almost don't know about it. They don't know about the violation of their rights and threats from the Russian Federation in Crimea. They don't know about the rich Crimean Tatar culture. And that looks quite strange, considering how much money I invested in the development of the Muslim and Islamic culture when you come for the Museum of Islamic Culture, for example, in Doha. So that's also one of those issues where we probably need to find connections and to bring information to Qatar so we can demonstrate the rich Islamic history of Ukrainian, part of the Ukrainian people, and to bring it to the Middle East.
People-to-people relations always matter, and when we talk about strategic dimensions of cooperation and big spheres like military or transportation, etc., it is very important not to omit from our attention that people should understand other people better so that this kind of cooperation thrive. And with this vision of prospects for future cooperation between Ukraine and Qatar, it is pleasant to wrap up our conversation because it gives certain insights and directions to move forward in developing our relations. Hanna, Omar, thank you so much for this insightful conversation, and thanks again for joining.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual website about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yarmolenko, I'm Chief Editor of UkraineWorld. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, Ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.